Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and World Review, our weekly look at the world's news. And joining us this week from Washington is Karen DeYoung, who is the associate editor and senior national security correspondent at the Washington Post. Karen, wonderful to have you. And from London, Gideon Rachman, who is the chief foreign affairs commentator for the Financial Times. Gideon, wonderful to have you. And from Politico's headquarters, in Washington, Matt Kaminski, who is the editor-in-chief and founding editor of Politico Europe, actually editor-in-chief of Politico and founding editor of Politico Europe. Matt, wonderful to have you here with us today. Well, lots of things to talk about. We could spend our time about how democracy counts votes, but go to another channel if you want to listen to that. Rather than figuring out what's going on in the world. And there's a lot happening in this interregnum between the election and the new president taking office on January 20th. And one of the big issues, Matt, let's start with you, is Iran. Long an issue of contention between Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and now when the issue of contention Donald Trump and Joe Biden. We've had some recent reports about what the Iranians are doing on the nuclear sphere and some suggestions that maybe the Trump administration isn't quite done yet with Iran and creating new problems or issues for Joe Biden. What's occurring, what's happening, and where do you think this is leading? And Matt, you're still muted, just FYI.
Sorry about that. Well, it may come as a surprise to some Americans, but the world does go on, even as we're always consumed with our own politics and with and Donald Trump, even as he's getting ready to leave. A couple of things this week that happened in Iran that are noteworthy, obviously. There's a UN report that Iran has 12 as much enriched uranium as it should have under the terms of the agreement signed by President Obama, abandoned by President Trump, but in theory still in force. 2 reports of Iran continues to deliver oil to Venezuela in contravention of sanctions imposed by primarily the US, but most of the world. And 3, the report out this week that President Trump did ask his advisors for military options against Iran. Presumably it would be to a missile strike against Natanz in the 60-odd days that he still has left in the presidency. I think maybe taking them in reverse order, we could be headed for the most unpredictable 2 months in American politics, this lame duck period Trump presidency. But I think there are reasons that we probably should not expect an American military action. Everything that President Trump is doing right now seems designed to prepare him for his post-presidency and to set him up to possibly run again. He has made it, in parallel, he's also wants to pull out troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq, and he is really banking a lot of his support with his core base on, I am the president who on the post 9/11 era and got America out of the Middle East and out of the business of intervening in other countries militarily. So I think that's probably not likely. The bigger question, and this is one where it'll be a bigger question for the Biden administration, is exactly what do you do about Iran? Yes, Iran has more enriched uranium than it should. Also has a lot less than it did when the deal was struck between Iran, the EU, and the US under President Obama. So what do you do to try and enforce those restrictions on Iran going forward after Inauguration Day? Biden has said he wants to, in some sense, go back to that agreement, or at least enforce the commitments that Iran made in that agreement. And he will try, but the story has moved on too. I don't think this administration is going to be, having seen what happens to an agreement that's not supported by Congress, that the subsequent president can always undo it, is necessarily going to rush into signing anything. 2, the situation in the region has changed quite significantly. You had Israel form alliances with some unlikely partners in Bahrain, the UAE. The Saudis hated this agreement, hates Iran. So that's going to limit America's options. And lastly, Iran itself has, I think, been active in the last 4 years too in forming alliances in China and Russia to try and protect itself from any from the West and from the U.S., whether that pressure comes in an economic form or in military form.
So a complicated situation, Karen, for the incoming administration, even assuming nothing happens in the next 60 days, or perhaps there are also rumors of additional sanctions perhaps being imposed, making it more difficult for Biden to move in a different way. Do you see this as a box in some ways, Biden in a policy in the way that Matt's putting it? That makes it very difficult to go back to the status quo ante, the 2015 agreement and its terms?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think Biden is boxed in by the situation, and already before Trump started doing whatever he's doing in these remaining couple of months in office. Biden has said he's kind of tried to split the difference, and in his appealing to the Europeans who are still in the deal, has said, well, we're willing to talk to them about going back, but that means that they have to go back to all the restrictions before, and we want some additional things. We want to talk about the sunset clauses. We want to talk about their missile program. We want to talk about proxies in places like Syria. Whether the Iranians see it to their advantage to have those conversations isn't clear yet. They've said, yeah, we're willing to go back to the deal, and that means no US sanctions. And because of the kind of lack of congressional support that Matt talked about, I think it's going to be very hard for Biden to do. He certainly says they're going to have a review, they're going to try to figure out what approach to take, and the Iranians have said, at least in the form of Foreign Minister Zarif, yes, we'll talk. Not clear who's behind Zarif. There are elections next year in Iran. The religious leaders have said, get it, United States, we're not interested, no matter what Zarif and even President Rouhani have said about it. So I think Biden comes in saying, yes, we're to go back to the deal with some discussion about some other things. It's not at all clear that that's going to be possible.
Gideon, of course, one of the big disagreements that the key European leaders, including Boris Johnson, had with Donald Trump was over the Iran nuclear deal, and there were some pretty vitriolic phone calls and meetings between then Prime Minister May and President Trump over this issue. And the Europeans, like the Russians and Chinese, are still in the deal. As far as they're concerned, there's one who's non-compliant and another that is moving away from compliance, the Iranians. How are they going to approach Joe Biden to try to figure out, to make it easier for him to come back into the deal or negotiate something different? How do they see it? And you're still muted as well, Kian.
Yeah, sorry about that. Look, I mean, I think that the Europeans' first reaction will be to hope that in some way be able to go back to the status quo before Trump. Now, as has just been explained, that's probably unlikely. All sorts of other things have changed, but broadly, they're relying on the Biden administration to be recommitted to multilateralism, certainly to move away from any idea of striking Iran militarily. And of course, that was the deep underlying fear for the Europeans, which was driving their policy, the concern that you were going to have another major war involving the US in the Middle East with all the ramifications of that. I think if that threat is felt to be off the table, they may relax more broadly and be prepared to kind of live with a variety of different American policies, as long as it doesn't feel as the US is heading down the path of potential conflict. I think they'll relax a bit.
I think it's a good reminder that one of the ways in which the Bush and then the Obama administration was able to get the Europeans to take this more seriously is by in some ways implicitly and at times explicitly threatened that if the alternative to stronger sanctions and negotiation was war, that's kind of been taken off the table until this week, when it seemed to be put back on the table. Karen?
Yeah.
Well, you did have, you did have these rocket strikes by an Iranian-backed militia in Iraq. Several of them landed inside the U.S. Embassy compound, which is inside the green zone. Didn't hurt anybody. Did hurt some others, did some Iraqis and killed one child. Trump has always said, well, the one thing that will cause me to strike back is if they kill any Americans. It's sort of not clear what whether the militias are just trying to, kind of increase the ante, the extent to which they're directly ordered by Iran to do this, the extent to which they fire these things in the knowledge that they're not actually going to hit anybody, just to see what the Americans will do about it. So that raises the temperature, and that's sort of different than saying, the Iranians are running more centrifuges and enriching more uranium, albeit still at a fairly low level compared to what they were doing for the agreement. So I think there's always that possible trigger, and you kind of never know what's going to happen.
So one thing worth to remember too is that that Soleimani, the head of the Revolutionary Guard, was killed last year. January 3rd is the anniversary. The Iranians have always said we're gonna get our revenge, and they have tried. There've been plots against apparently American embassies and American ambassadors, but they haven't done anything just yet. But that anniversary is coming up, and I think that's probably on the minds of a lot of people in Iran, and something that could be another spark in the coming weeks if they do act in any way.
It does remind one that in this very strange American style period between elections and inauguration tends to be fraught with uncertainty, instability, made worse by the fact that there is no formal transition and there is no exchange of information between the outgoing and the incoming administrations, let alone intelligence information, which presumably would be particularly useful at this stage if something like that were to happen, whether it's in Iraq or anywhere else in the region, or even beyond. Some of the plots were all the way in South Africa, I believe, that the Iranians were behind. So it shows that the world does not stop just because there is a disagreement in the United States about counting votes, as Matt put it. Karen, another sort of big change that happened after the votes were cast is the announcement the other day by the acting Secretary of Defense, who was put in place after his predecessor ceremoniously, I think the word was terminated by President Trump.
By tweet.
By tweet, because that's the only way that apparently happens, right? Acting Secretary Miller announced a drawdown of troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, and there are also reports of further drawdowns in Somalia. Where did that come from? How does that square with the kind of condition-based approach that the Trump administration has often heralded when it comes to these troops in both Afghanistan and Somalia? Another place where we have troops most people don't know, but we do, also being affected.
Well, I think you sort of have to go back to the beginning of the Trump administration, and in fact his campaign in 2016. He always promised, I'm going to end these wars. I'm going to end these endless wars. We've been in Afghanistan for now it's almost 20 years. Been in Iraq for almost as long, with numbers going up and down. But in fact, Trump actually increased the numbers when he first came in. And since then, he's been trying to get them to come down. And he blames his own advisors, and particularly the Pentagon, for thwarting him at every opportunity. But nonetheless, the numbers have been slowly coming down. He announced a couple of weeks ago that all the troops in Afghanistan were going to be home by Christmas. His national security advisor said, yeah, there'll only be 2,500 left there. And the military said, no, they're not going to be home by Christmas. So you had this upheaval, and Trump all of a sudden then announces that they're going to be down to 2,500 in both Iraq and in Afghanistan, which really isn't that much when you think about it. I mean, they're already down to about 2,700 in Iraq, and so they're going to be another couple of hundred. They said it was 500, but I think it's really not. They've got about 4,000 in Afghanistan. They're going to come down by about 1,500. So that theoretically is going to happen by January 15th. In both places, there is, the United States is part of a coalition with NATO. And certainly in Afghanistan, where there are somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 NATO troops, various countries, the largest being Germany, the UK, Italy. You saw a real flash of anger. Oh, wait a minute, we were supposed to coordinate this. We can't stay there without you because you are the enablers. You do the medevacs, you do the logistic, you fly the strikes that help protect the Afghan security forces. So you didn't consult with us on this, and we want an explanation. At the same time, you've got this deal that the Americans in February signed with the Taliban, saying that we will gradually withdraw based on certain conditions. And the conditions for the Taliban were a reduction in violence, severing ties with al-Qaeda, and starting real negotiations toward a political solution in Afghanistan with the government there. They haven't severed ties with al-Qaeda. There's been, in fact, an increase in violence, and the negotiations started, but they haven't really gone anywhere. They're kind of at a stalemate. So what happened to the conditions? Are they just jettisoning the deal that they themselves signed almost a year ago? So why is this happening? Why is Trump doing this? He wants to position himself to be a player for the next 4 years when he's not president, and leave open the options to run again in 2024, excuse me. At the same time, you have Biden, who also says he's going to stop the endless, and also says he wants to bring troops home, but says he wants to review the whole situation, but he can't start doing that because of what you said. There's been no transition started because Trump hasn't conceded that he lost. And so I think things will sort of, yes, they will probably come down to 25 in both places, and then sort of sit there while Biden figures out what he wants to do. Interestingly enough, you see in Congress, the Democrats are largely for the withdrawal, and the Republicans have been quite critical, many Republicans, of Trump, saying, what are you doing? There's still a war on in Afghanistan. Yes, we want to get out, but let's do it in some kind of orderly way, and let's think about it. And the underlying rationale behind all that is, let's not do it for political reasons. Let's do it based on what the conditions actually are.
A lot to unpack.
A bit of a
few here. Matt, jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a little bit of deja vu all over again here, going back, let's say, a decade in American domestic politics as foreign policy, and vice versa. I think President Obama was
did the same thing.
Essentially beaten Hillary Clinton because I will get our boys home, our boys and women, by the way, so now these days, from Iraq. He committed to Afghanistan against Joe Biden's wishes, but he did sort of withdraw fully from Afghanistan, from Iraq in 2011, and then had to, a couple years later, concede that it created a huge problem, and that's when we brought the troops back. I think any time where domestic politics sort of shapes foreign affairs is going to get very messy. And clearly there is what Obama recognized and rode the wave on, and what Trump clearly sees. There is not domestic support for having our troops in the Middle East. In some ways, we're still reliving the kind of the Bush wars of the previous decade. But the situation is what it is on the ground. And, Biden, I guess, to my mind, if he can get us to a position in the U.S. where having troops in Iraq and Afghanistan is no different than having troops in Korea and Germany, where they've been for the last 70 years, then you sort of, that stops being a domestic issue. But for now it is, and Trump sees that very, very clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel it's, he'd be so lucky, obviously, Iraq and Afghanistan just ain't Korea and Germany. And I do slightly wonder what Biden's own instincts are on this, because I remember earlier in the year talking to General Allen, who's now head of the Brookings Institution, but because of his experience in Afghanistan, I think felt quite strongly and almost kind of emotionally that it would be a very discreditable thing for America to pull out of Afghanistan precipitously. And I said to him, this was when the Democrat race was still on, look, is there anybody in the Democrat field who actually would agree with you? And he said, Joe Biden. He felt that Biden was the representative of that more traditional view. But whether Biden, once president, will still be his instinct, whether the politics will let him do that, I have no idea. And also, I mean, I was interested in Karen's description of the European reaction. I suppose it's a reminder to the Europeans in a slightly unpleasant way that for all the talk of this being an alliance of equals, it's usually America that decides what's going to happen. It was America that decided we would go into Afghanistan, and it is America that seems to be dictating the manner in which we'll leave.
But I think it also should be said about Biden. Biden was the one under Obama who was opposed to big troop increase in Afghanistan, and he said during the campaign, when asked, well, how can you, until the Taliban has sort of agreed to a political structure that allows the continuation of civil rights and women's rights that are among the things that we fought so hard to establish in Afghanistan, how can you pull out before that's guaranteed? And Biden said, look, not our problem. He said, you don't impose that kind of thing. There are other things we can do. We can go to the UN, we can impose sanctions, we can use a bully pulpit, but we are not sending our troops to fight for women's rights, is essentially what he said.
I do think a fair sort of, given where he was in 2009, very clearly underlining the importance of maintaining a counterterrorism posture, right, as opposed to nation building posture. And he's been very consistent in his views ever since. I think the challenge is going to be for him is how does he get the rest of his cabinet and the rest of the U.S. military, which is clearly in the General Allen kind of view. We've invested greatly. Let's not let any of that investment go. And now I think also, as you said, Karen, the Republican versus Democratic dynamic, the domestic political dynamic, because he's trying to be the middle ground between leaving completely and staying in order to have a logical influence and focusing on the one issue, why we're there, which is the terrorism issue.
Well, but also, both the current administration and Biden say, yes, we're going to leave a counterterrorism. The current negotiations are how to get the Taliban in the government. The Taliban says there is not going to be a counterterrorism force here. And the agreement that the Americans signed with the Taliban to get them to talk in the first place says nothing about a residual counterterrorism force. It says everybody out.
Yeah, that's the difficulty that we're confronting, no doubt, on this issue. On the European issue, it is. I did think it was quite remarkable to have a statement from the NATO Secretary General, which was pretty vociferous about in together, out together, which, by the way, is the mantra that the U.S. has used to keep Europeans in. For a long time. I speak from experience, having said that more than enough times, sometimes failingly, by the way. But nevertheless, it is a lesson of dependence that the Europeans have that will translate perhaps into different behavior down the road as we go along. Speaking about Europe, Gideon, a few months ago, we all talked about this amazing budget deal that the European Union had put together, including borrowing money on behalf of the Union to be given to some of its members. It was truly remarkable. It even passed the European Parliament, but it's stuck. And it's stuck over not COVID, not economics, but politics and the rule of law. What's happening in Brussels and in Europe on this really important issue? Because it seems to me it's getting to some of the core issues of the Union when you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, in a way, the collision of two really crucial issues. The first is this budget issue that you referred to, which was a breakthrough because for the first time, the EU was going to borrow as a collective, as a union, and spend the money on union projects. And that is sort of symbolically, but also practically in terms of political integration, political and fiscal integration. That's something people have been looking to for many years, at least since the beginning of the Euro crisis, probably before. So they don't want to see it, having made this breakthrough, sort of collapse over procedural reasons. But the reason it's in trouble is because it's run into another big issue, which is the European Union's aspiration statement that it is a coalition, an alliance of 7 law-governed democracies. And there's been an increasing feeling, grounded in reality, that in Poland and Hungary, that's becoming less the case, that the Hungarians and indeed the Poles have, for example, tinkered with the independence of the courts, have begun to have certainly brought state media very firmly under the control of the government. They're sort of close to propaganda arms. And the EU was very uncomfortable about this. So what they're trying to do is to say, look, these are countries that benefit hugely from EU funds generally, from the EU budget, and that stand to gain again from this new pot of money they've raised collectively to spend on COVID. So we're going to attach spending to respect for the rule of law. In other words, if you don't play ball on democracy and independence of the courts, you won't get the money. But it sounds like a great idea. The difficulty with that is that the way the EU makes big decisions, each country still has a veto. And so Poland and Hungary are vetoing this because they see it correctly as targeted at them. And you have a standoff at the moment. You know, I'm not currently in Brussels, but everything I know about the history of the way these things happen and what I hear from talking to people involved at the moment is that there'll be a compromise, not because the Poles and the Hungarians are incredibly reasonable chaps who will just say, oh, fine, we apologize, you know, we did this by mistake, we'll be good guys from now on. It's more that, frankly, they need the money. So the EU does have leverage. You know, if they block the budget, in the end, they block something that is hugely beneficial to these countries. I think the difficulty will be, you know, they'll get some alteration probably in the language of the compromise. And does the EU, in creating this compromise that will free up the money and get the Poles and Hungarians to accept it, so water down the rule of law provisions that the Hungarians and the Poles can more or less get on with business as usual? I mean, that rule of law provisions would be quite hard to invoke even as they stand. And it may be that they get so hollowed out that the Hungarians and Poles can actually accept them relatively cheerfully. I mean, I don't know what Matt thinks. He's I think worked out of Brussels more recently than me.
Matt, how do you see it? The likely way out of the muddling through European Union usually finds a way out, but how are they going to get out of this pickle? Particularly also because the rule of law piece was imposed by Parliament as part of his approval of the budget in the first place. They're triangulating between the countries, the Poles and the Hungarians and Parliament all at the same time.
Well, you wish you could say that Budapest and Warsaw is essentially the fiscal hawks here, and they're blocking this on sort of principled grounds. That is, alas, not the case for the reasons that Gideon pointed out. You know, this comes back to it really is it comes back to the long-running argument in Brussels about how do you handle the sort of Orban, and then now how do you handle the sort of Poles? Because as much as you can criticize Hungary, Poland and Hungary over the backtracking on sort of on democracy, generally speaking, there was no bite really to what Brussels could do. And someone very smartly noticed, well, these are huge recipients of EU funding. They really depend on this stuff. And so the only way that we can really sort of get that bite into EU policy, EU relationship with Poland and Hungary, is to tie it to the budget, which obviously these countries don't like the sound of. So it's kind of it's probably a little bit of a sort of game of chicken, and you could say that this could threatens a move by the EU to become a borrower. It undermines the institutional arrangements that have sort of kind of creakily worked for over decades in the EU, and yet probably the smart money is on some kind of muddle. I don't know if Gideon coined the muddling through, and when he was writing the Charlemagne column 20 years ago, but that is the EU default. There will be some messy compromise. I think Orban, at the end of the day, knows that he leads a fairly small power, small country in the European Union that depends on the EU for a lot. And I guess as always, the key player will be Germany. To what degree is Angela Merkel willing to throw her weight around in Brussels or with Warsaw and Budapest? And knowing her, it'll probably land somewhere in the middle. So I think the sort of compromise solution where you water down regions that weren't that strong to begin with, and you get the deal through because they need the money, and then you sort of say, well, is this sort of good for the longer term health of the EU? Probably not, but it'll get the EU to next month or to next year.
Yeah. I think just one further thought is actually, I think what's happened in the US does affect the atmosphere, because Orban and the Poles look to Trump for kind of moral and political support. And I think that they will be feeling a little more isolated now after the American election result.
Yeah, I wanted to, Karen, the issue, of course, is going to be decided in Europe and certainly not in Washington, but you couldn't have two more different presidents between Trump and Biden when it comes to this particular issue, both in terms of support for Europe and European integration, and in relation to the particular two leaders, Orban and Duda, the Polish president and prime minister of Hungary, who have had easy access to the White House until recently, but were, of course, not invited when Obama was in the White House, and are unlikely to be invited by Biden. Do you see a possibility of that change playing out in some way to positive effect?
Well, Biden has said one of his first and highest foreign policy priorities is to reestablish the transatlantic relationship, and by that he does not mean Hungary and Poland. He means Germany, France, and so I think that you've already seen the opposition forces in both Hungary and Poland, who are fairly strong, say, "Great, Biden, terrific. He's our guy. We're so glad Trump's getting out of here." So I think that, yeah, that can be both, as Gideon said, a sort of moral and political, and who gets invited to the White House kind of thing. But it's also, are troops, U.S. troops, going to go to Poland? Are we going to, reestablish all these headquarters there the way Trump has said we were going to? We don't know. So I do think that probably the most important thing will be what my colleagues have outlined, which is just that both Hungary are going to need the money. It's got economic recovery funds in this horrible situation everybody's in. It's got the COVID relief funds that they both need. And so on that side, they're going to have to give. And on the other side, the EU is generally a pretty mushy place, and they figure out a way to muddle through. But I think that certainly on the margins, Biden and the new administration will have an influence. And there are some things they can do to show their disapproval of those two countries' governments.
In the final few minutes we have left, let me switch gear to the Middle East, and the U.S. Secretary of State made a visit to Turkey, a variety of other places, but of course also in the last 24 hours in the Middle East, and part of it was to, I think, help the normalization of the relationship between Bahrain and Israel, and the Bahraini foreign minister was there to some of those agreements. But it also had a larger purpose, particularly in the ways where Pompeo went to visit Karen. And how do you read this visit? Where did he go, and what was he trying to accomplish here?
It's hard to tell what he was trying to accomplish in policy terms, except to reiterate some Trump positions that are very definitely not Biden positions. This is a 10-day trip, 7 different countries, has the advantage of taking Pompeo out of the country from all of this sort of argy-bargy and kind of pointless argument, some of which got the defense secretary fired and a lot of other officials. And I would think it moves Pompeo in his sort of persona as a Trump guy, but above it all, to not be here. So that's one thing. The other thing is very specific things to do in a lot of these countries. In Turkey, he didn't meet with any government officials, despite all the real problems there are between the United States and Turkey right now. He met only with the ecumenical patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is based in Istanbul. Said he had no time to meet with Turkish officials, who actually refused to meet with him because he wouldn't come to Ankara. He said he would only see them in Istanbul. What did Pompeo get out of that? A boost for his religious freedom agenda, which he has cited in the past weeks as the greatest accomplishment of his tenure at the State Department. A lot of video, if he decides that he has an ongoing political career beyond January, and certainly in 2024. Similarly, in Israel, underscoring the fact that the Trump administration has declared that Israeli settlements in the West are not illegal. He, for the first time, the most senior U.S. official ever to visit settlements on the West Bank, to visit the Golan Heights, whose annexation by Israel the Trump administration also recognized, to put out some orders that declare that the disinvest movement against Israel is anti-Semitic, as opposed to something that's opposed to the policies of a government. Goods produced on the West Bank can be stamped "Made in Israel," as opposed to "Made on the West Bank," which are sort of symbolic things. But again, I think for Pompeo, they give him, at the end of the day, they kind of solidify this track record that he hopes undergird what he considers his main accomplishments now and in the future. And also to kind of once again tout the Abraham Accords as great peace deals, even though they're not really peace deals because nobody who signed them was at war with each other. Nonetheless, it is something of an accomplishment. Yeah, that was Pompeo's trip.
Matt, to what extent, particularly the visit to Israel, is it also designed to box Biden into a series of policy initiatives that the Trump administration has taken, from moving the embassy to Jerusalem, to recognize annexation of the Golan Heights, to putting a peace plan on the table of that would allow for the annexation of 30% of the West Bank, and some other issues. These are hot issues here at home that perhaps are designed to make it more difficult to be reversed under a new administration?
I mean, it probably had that intended effect, and I do think there's, the move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that's not going to be reversed. It's hard to imagine that happening. But the bigger point is, it's a common theme throughout our conversation, where American foreign policy has been, currently is, and for the near future will be about domestic politics. It was out there. I think there's two things that one can kind of see clearly right now. The Trump era is not going to end with January 20th inauguration of Joe Biden, and the 2024 campaign is on us right now. And I'm sad to say, Gideon, I really hate to tell you this, but you will be have to pay attention to American electoral politics starting now, as it sort of plays out to 2024. Pompeo he's a very ambitious man, and it's no secret what he's looking at. It's also no secret what Tom Cotton's looking at, what Marco Rubio, Nikki Haley, all the way to Paul Ryan. And this is where the interesting story in American politics will be, to what degree can Donald Trump keep his hold on the Republican Party and keep his hold on the base, while there are there are half a dozen to a dozen people who would love to see him go quietly away. Because they will sort of claim the mantle, but they'll claim it for themselves. So I think just seeing it purely through a political electoral prism is the only sane way to, and only probably straightforward way to look at this.
So Gideon, if Matt is right, and I don't actually have no reason to believe he's not, what does that do for the world, since you represent in the conversation? How does the world deal with that reality of, because the last 4 years, frankly, have been about the foreign policy was about domestic politics. If the next 4 years are going to be about that, what does it say about, the world in and of itself? And how do countries like the United Kingdom itself, embroiled in all kinds of difficulties, deal with that challenge?
Well, I mean, I think credibility, to use a word that's been overused in the past, but it is seriously undermined. And I think that both because of what's happened over the last 4 years, because of this sense that a return to normalcy as it existed before is unlikely, simply because Trump's performance was strong enough that even if somehow he is levered out of the White House, as touch wood, looks likely at the moment, he's not going to disappear off the American political scene, and certainly what he represents is not going to disappear off the American political scene. And the Republican Party has not repudiated Trumpism. On the contrary, they had to indulge some of what he's doing. And I don't think you should understate the shock value of what's happening and the way it will resonate. For me, a moment when Pompeo, who we were just discussing, is asked at the podium of the State Department if he can guarantee a peaceful transition after the election, and he says there'll be a transition to a second Trump term. That was a real shock, because we outside in the Western world, and in the world generally, look to the United States as to some extent, for all its missteps, the arbiter of democracy, the place that, if it calls out an election or a dictator, election gone wrong, or a dictator's behaving badly, that resonates. It has a certain force, a political force and a moral force. And here, to see the American government itself disregarding its own democratic processes is a shock, profoundly shocking. And I think it's more than that. It's totally plays into the hands of the Russians, the Chinese, etc., whose central argument for many years has been that Western moralizing about democracy is empty, it's posturing, we're all the same, really. And here you have an American government that appears to confirm that says, yeah, we actually don't respect our own elections. Our media lies as well. Our courts are not to be trusted. It's everything that they want you to believe coming out of Beijing and Moscow, and that's not going to be wiped away very easily by Biden. Now, of course, there'll be a great relief amongst American allies if you have a more conventional American president saying the right things, doing the right things, but there's a question about how much can get done domestically. There's a question about how long he'll be around for, and and also just about the state of American society, because this crisis in democracy also coincides with a kind of epic failure to deal with COVID-19. Obviously European figures have been really bad as well, so we can't kind of lecture you, but America has been regarded as a country that leads the world in science and public health and so on. Clearly not in this case. Yeah, I mean, it's going to take a while to assimilate everything that's been going on, and maybe in a year or two's time, everyone will be saying, "Wow, that was really weird," but it's kind of back to the America we thought we knew. But I suspect it's going to be more complicated than that, and that the world, while it will, it doesn't really have an alternative to America. So it's not like America can say, "Oh well, the Americans are completely crazy, so let's just go with this other superpower out there." There isn't another one. So to some extent, we're forced to rely on the United States. But the question marks raised by the Trump era are not going to disappear.
Well, those are question marks that we will continue to hear on World Review every Friday. I want to thank Gideon Rachman, Matt Kaminski, and Karen DeYoung so much for a wonderful, not always pleasant and uplifting, but nevertheless realistic conversation about the state of the world and how all of the countries, including the United States, are dealing with it. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a fantastic weekend. And for those from the United States, have a great Thanksgiving, but do it in small family gatherings. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ivo.